The local community college is analyzing student grades in 2 freshman courses. The freshman enrollment is currently 264 students. They collected a random sample of 75 grades in English and 75 grades in history and displayed the results in the box plots below. Which conclusion is best supported by the given information and the data in the box plots? Alright, so we had this long setup right over here, but we didn't need it so much. We basically just need to go through our answer choices and figure out which conclusion is best supported by these 2 box plots. The most important thing to remember about a box plot, let's sketch this real quick, is that each quartile represents 25%. So I'll put my median line right there. And that's a pretty even box plot, but essentially the first whisker portion is 25% of my data. The second whisker portion is another 25% of the data. The third, sorry that wasn't a whisker but inside the box portion. The third portion that's inside the box represents 24%, 25%, and then finally the fourth quartile, which is right over here in the last whisker, represents 25%. So I have 25, 25, 25, 25 makes 100%. And that's what box plots do. They separate your data into quarters, essentially, into fourths or 25%. So we can use that then to compare these 2 box plots and then look at our answers and see which one makes the most sense. Answer A says students are more likely to score below a 70 in history than in English. Okay, well let me go to the zoomed in version. That means 70 is right here. And it says history is going to have more students that scored below a 70. Well, remember that the first whisker represents 25%. So English has 25% of their students that scored below a 70. But history is going to have less than 25% because that bar still goes up to about 75. So A is not going to be right because A actually has a lower percent of students that scored below 70. 25% of their students scored probably about here, which is below a 75. So A is not going to work. B says students are more likely to score above a 90 in history. Again, I'll circle it. Than in English, above a 90. So if I erase out what we have, that means above a 90, 90 is about right there, and it says they're more likely to score a 90 in history. Well, if you look, they both have the last quartile above a 90, 25%. So it's actually going to be even. History doesn't have a greater chance of scoring above 90. They would be even. There'd be an even chance of scoring above 90, so B won't work either. C says students are more likely to score below an 80 in English, than in history. Let me wipe this here. So below an 80 in English than in history. So 80 is right here. And it says students are going to be more likely to score below an 80 in English than in history. So there's going to be more data for English. If we look at English, I have 25% falls where that whisker is. And then I'll put an arrow, another 25% falls right there. So 50% of the English data is below an 80. Now on history, below an 80 is right here, and it's going to represent this 25%, but I don't have a full 25% that's below 80. I have just some of them. So history is not going to have as high a percent that is below 80. So if we go back to the answer, it says students are more likely to score below an 80 in English. Yes, they are, because English is 50%, and history is probably going to be more like, if I just guesstimated, maybe 30% or something. So C is the best answer so far. D says students are more likely to score between an 80 and 90 in English than in history. Between an 80 and 90 in English than in history. If I wipe this out and look at that, so that means between an 80 and 90 is right here. 80 is there, 90 is there. And they said they're more likely to do that in English than in history. English has 50% of the data. Well, I should say 25% of the data in this area right over here. But between an 80 and a 90, more likely to score, don't necessarily think so. It would be kind of, if we look at our answer choices, in English and in history, the data is pretty even. I have 25 that's right there, and I actually have a leftover part of the percent from this 25 that would be added to this 25%. I know that makes it kind of complex, but essentially history is going to have more students that would have that, so D isn't right. The best selection is C. So this is essentially how well you understand box plots and then comprehending the answer choices. A little bit complex, but if you put the time in to go in and really highlight and write in each part of the box plot and the percents, I think it'll pay off with finding the right solution.